Okay, so my name is Bobby Wingranowitz. I'm going to do the introductions and then help with moderation. We're really happy that you're all here tonight, and the way that this is set up is that this is just going to be kind of an introduction. If you don't even know what divestment means, then you'll soon get to find out. What we're going to do is 45 minutes for our three panelists, 15 minutes for each of them, and then we got another 45 minutes for question and answers and conversations. So I'd encourage you to be thinking of questions when all of the panelists go, because that's a lot of time to really have a nice conversation. So let me introduce our three panelists. This is in the order of how they're going to go. We have David Zwick. He is an investment advisor consultant at Progressive Asset Management Group. This is a socially and environmentally responsible investment group. It's been in operation for about 20 years. David has been there for at least the past couple of years. They've seen a lot of new business with the 350.org divestment campaign going on. Sorry, actually, David is going to go second. Our first speaker is going to be Jeremy Shakun. He is a recent hire here at Boston College. Let's see, in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences. He got his PhD in geology from Oregon State. He's bounced around. He's been at a few schools since then. Most recently, he was a visiting fellow at Harvard. And Jeremy does paleoclimate work, so he looks at past climate change going back the past few million years, and tries to figure out what we can learn from past changes about the current changes that are going on. And then our last speaker is going to be Alli Welton. Alli would be a junior right now at Harvard, but she decided to take some time off because the climate crisis is that urgent and that important to her. So she's played an important role in Divest Harvard, and she also works with students for a just and stable future. So with that, without further ado, here is Jeremy.
Thanks, Bobby. Thanks, guys, for being here. Fire up my magic wand. All right. So I'm going to give you about 15 minutes of just kind of the climate system's complicated, but I'm going to give you the kind of quick and dirty 15 minutes of what's important to know, I guess, as we think about divestment. So if you've ever seen this curve, it might look familiar. This is CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere rising over the last 50 years. And the question we have is, where does this lead? What happens as CO2 keeps climbing? And the shorter answer is probably nowhere particularly good. This is where we probably don't want to keep climbing up too high. And so I love my field. I love being a climate scientist, but in some ways it's kind of crappy because people are always asking you, so what do you do? And you say climate scientist, and you say, oh, global warming, what's the story? What's that all about? And you're like, well, it's not a pretty picture. It's actually kind of, a depressing story a little bit. And so I sort of view being a climate scientist in 2014, sort of giving bad news, is probably like being an economist in 2008, where you're like, this isn't the best thing. Or like being the first Native American and seeing the first, the first white guy come over the hill being like, oh man, this is bad. I gotta, tell everybody else. I think this is sort of where climate scientists are at right now. Sort of got the science figured out enough to realize, like, this is not probably the best situation in the long run. So I hope I don't depress you. I don't know if you guys are Grumpy Cat fans, but I hope I don't bum you out too much. But the other thing you should take from this talk is that we're actually at a pretty pivotal time in geologic history, really. We're only a little way into this global warming story. We haven't warmed up that much. CO2 levels haven't climbed ridiculously high yet, and we're really at a critical point where we can totally change which direction we're headed in terms of warming of the climate in the future. So pivotal times. So one thing I want to point out is there's still a lot of uncertainty in all sorts of bits and pieces about climate change, which is good because that gives me a job, trying to figure out lots of interesting pieces. But what I would say is a lot of the uncertainty in climate change is really in the details. Detailed questions about exactly how fast will sea level rise, how strong will hurricanes get, how will it change here versus there, Boston versus wherever else, how will tornadoes change. It's a lot of detailed things. And that's really where we're at. Those are the main questions we're asking. The big picture stuff, at this point, I kind of wish I was in the older generation, because the older generation of scientists got to figure out the really big, fundamental, interesting pieces, and that stuff's all, at this point, pretty well settled, kind of getting written into the textbooks. We're really more at the detailed level questions at this point. So the big picture, pretty darn clear. We know, burn more fossil fuels, you're going to emit more CO2 to the atmosphere, it's going to stay there, it's going to give you a stronger greenhouse effect, it's going to give you a warmer planet, and a lot of the details of exactly what happens with the warmer planet here versus there and when, some of that stuff's tricky to figure out exactly. But no one has any real doubt that you add a ton of extra heat to the climate system and basically everything is going to start to change. The climate system is this huge machine of all of these moving pieces that are all connected to each other. You start changing something as basic as the greenhouse effect of our planet, everything's pretty much going to feel it. And that stuff's really textbook at this point. There's really not much debate going on about that. And just to point out to you, this is old stuff. We've known CO2 is a greenhouse gas that keeps the planet warm. This is the guy who did it. This isn't, something new. This is old. Before the Civil War, this guy figured out that CO2 keeps the planet warm. And I always imagine if John Tyndall were alive today, he saw the stuff going on in the media and the debate, he would be like, you've got to be kidding me. I did this before Einstein was born. This is ridiculous. Okay, so getting down to the basic numbers that you need to know. Most countries in the world haven't done a whole lot about climate change at this point. Really haven't done a lot. The one thing they've done, I think you could say fairly's paid a bit of lip service, but what they've said is important. And most countries have agreed we can't warm the planet more than 2 degrees Celsius. That's often taken as kind of the red line. We don't want to go beyond that. Anything beyond that, we're sort of getting into the dangerous level of we don't want to deal with the world it's that warm, with sea levels changing that much, rainfall changing that much. This is just absolutely beyond a speed bump for society. This is getting us into the point of a little dangerous. We don't want to do it. So all these different countries here signed on to this accord a few years ago. They all have said 2 degrees. Nowhere past that. We can't do it. So how much is too much CO2 then? The basic question is how much CO2 can you pump into the air before you hit this 2 degree magic number? And I guess what I should also mention is there really isn't anything magical about 2 degrees. It's just sort of the number that's been picked out. There's actually plenty of scientists who would tell you they think maybe 1.5 would be safer. Maybe some would even say don't go past 1. Some of them think 2 is already getting too high. If you look at past climate changes, once you get to 2, things are already getting kind of crazy. Don't go there. Suffice it to say, though, 2 has really been picked out internationally as the number we will call the red line. But it's not like everything's fine at 1.9 and it goes to hell at 2. But that's the number that's been picked out. So this is really the key piece of information to take in. This is a new graph based on old research, but a new graph from latest IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, sort of the leading global scientific organization. And what it shows you is the amount of warming that you get on the planet is basically determined by how much carbon we emit. We emit more carbon, the warmer the planet gets. And the units we use to talk about carbon are gigatons, so billion tons of carbon. The more carbon we emit, the warmer we get. So if we look at our 2 degree red line, that puts us in this range right here for carbon. Basically, somewhere around 1,000. Somewhere around 1,000 gigatons of carbon, plus or minus a bit. There's a little window in here. But we really don't want to emit more than that, otherwise we're going to go above 2 degrees. Okay, so that tells us kind of our limit, our cap on how high, how much more carbon we can emit. And here are the key numbers you need to know, and this is really the writing on the wall for the future. We've already emitted over 500 gigatons. We're already more than halfway there up to this point in history. We're currently emitting about 10 gigatons of carbon. That's what's shown over here. And not only are we emitting carbon each year, we're emitting it faster and faster and faster every year, something like 2% faster every year. So if you do the numbers here, use some models, deal with the statistics, the uncertainties, and all of it. Let's say you want to have a 2 out of 3 chance of staying below 2 degrees Celsius of warming. 2 out of 3, 66% chance we stay below that. We basically need to stop at 790 gigatons of carbon total. So another couple hundred gigatons, that's really got to be the limit. We've got to put a cap on it. If you do the math, that's coming out to somewhere within a couple decades. We need to just stop. And I'll make that point clear. It's not that in a couple decades we need to level off our emissions so that they're stable or something. They need to stop. We need to go to 0. Just not burning any more oil, any more coal, not filling any more gas in your car, just nothing within a couple decades, which is a ridiculously tall order. And so I think a lot of people are kind of looking at this like, ooh, we are flirting with that line, or kind of maybe already getting ourselves past it, because that's just hard to see how that's going to happen. The other bit of science that I want you to understand here that I think is often really underappreciated, and it's a tricky one, is that there's a lot of inertia associated with the climate. Imagine the climate is this huge freighter out on the ocean. One thing, it takes a good push to get it going, but once you've got the climate going, it's really hard to stop it and to turn it back around. There's a ton of inertia. And there's a few reasons for it, so let me walk you through them. I think I got 3 or 4 pieces of inertia here. One is there's just thermal inertia. It just takes time for the climate to warm up. You can't just raise CO2 levels and boom, the climate instantly warms up. And the biggest reason for that is we have gigantic oceans on the planet. So much water that they take up so much heat that the climate can't instantly warm up. So we're raising CO2 levels higher and higher every year, and the climate's warming up, trying to keep up with those rising CO2, but it still hasn't fully caught up to the CO2 levels today. And that's kind of because the ocean's keeping us cool at the moment. So in some ways this is great. We would be warmer if we didn't have oceans. They're keeping us cool at the moment. The downside is, if we stabilize CO2 at today's levels, the climate would just keep on warming a good bit more as it catches up. And we actually have about another ½ degree or so of warming that's sort of in the pipeline. It's already written in. It's coming. And to date, we've already warmed about 0.8 degrees over the last 100 years. So you add that and that, we're already at 1.3 is pretty much a given. You can see where 2 is not that far off until we reach that point. So that's one. Another source of inertia is CO2. It's kind of just an unfortunate fact of chemistry and physics of the planet that we throw some CO2 out of our tailpipe. It won't just come out of the atmosphere too quickly. And here's basically what happens to CO2. If you send a pulse of CO2 into the atmosphere, it will come down, but look at this graph. This graph goes out 40,000 years. A bunch will come out in the first few centuries, and then more slowly, and then incredibly slowly. And that last 20% is just painfully long lingerer. And you're talking like 100,000 years to scrub that stuff out and get us back to before what the atmosphere was like before we started burning fossil fuels. Which is crazy to think. So a lot of the CO2 we put in the air right now, like it'll still be there when my grandkids are around and their great-grandkids and their great-great-great-great-great-great. You know, it's not going away too quickly. One other source of inertia is ice sheets. We have big oceans, but we also have 2 gigantic ice sheets on Greenland and Antarctica. And these things are huge. They're so big you melt them, sea level goes up 200 feet. Again, inertia is our friend at the moment, because you can't melt an ice cube the size of a continent in 50 years or even in 100 years, which is great. So over the rest of the century, sea level probably will go up something like this much, which is a problem for sure. But we still can't melt this whole ice sheet in 100 years. The downside with this is that in the next, say, stretch of decades, we raise the carbon dioxide levels, which aren't coming down soon. We raise the temperature, which keeps going and isn't going to come down anytime soon. And these ice sheets just keep melting and melting and melting in response to that warming. And so sea levels just keep on rising and rising and rising. And that's probably going to be one of the longest legacies of what we're doing right now, is we can put out a big burp of carbon in the next 50 years, and the sea level will just rise for the next 700. And if you do the math, it's something like this. At the rate of emissions today, basically every decade of further emissions is locking in something like an additional foot or so of sea level rise. Not that we'll get that foot in 1 decade, but it's written in. It's coming. It's, you know, it's locked in. And then the last piece of inertia, this is getting way outside of my field, but it's important to keep in mind, is just that, let's say tonight we decided, okay, global warming is getting too bad, we don't want to deal with this anymore, let's go to solar, wind, nuclear, biomass, whatever you want, just get off of this stuff. How long does that take? How long does it take to re-engineer the entire infrastructure of the energy systems on the planet? Right? That's going to take quite a while to do. And so again, the ship is hard to turn around. And I always think global warming is a tricky one for people because people are used to problems where, you know, it becomes a problem and then you deal with it and you clean it up and then you go about your business. And this is just not like that because of all of these huge sources of inertia. If you wait till you're at the point where you're like, this is a problem, it's just going to keep plowing ahead for a long time after that. You can't just go back, which is why there really has to be some kind of anticipatory action, some sort of preemptive thought with this one. And so I think a lot of people don't appreciate this inertia, and I think they don't realize that right now we're just putting huge changes in place. And I'm pretty sure that my kids, their kids are going to look back and be like, oh my God, they had no, they didn't realize at all what they were putting into motion. Okay, the last thing I want to mention, touching on paleoclimate, because that's what I do, is if you guys pay attention to climate at all, this is the typical view you get on climate change. This is global temperature over the last 100 years, and it warmed 0.8 degrees like we said. And here's the projections for the next century on where temperatures go, depending if we burn just a little more fossil fuel or if we burn a lot of fossil fuel. Maybe it warms 1 degree, maybe it warms another 4 degrees. But what does that really mean? What does it mean to warm the planet 3 degrees? Is that a lot? Is that a little? It doesn't sound that big. I don't know. Some colleagues and I in the last few years have been pooling together kind of all of the good paleoclimate data that's out there to figure out what global temperature has done going back 20,000 years. So I just want to show this to you in one graph because I think it just spells it out very clearly in really tangible terms. So you can kind of get a feel in your bones for what this means. And I won't go through all of this here, I know I'm low on time, but basically, here's this global temperature reconstruction that we put together based on lots of good paleoclimate data from all over the world. 20,000 years ago, we were in an ice age, right? Boston had 1,000 feet of ice over our head. Over 10,000 years, we warmed a few degrees out of the ice age. And then for the last 10,000 years, we've been kind of sitting pretty, just smooth sailing, pretty stable global climate. And maybe not coincidentally, this is pretty much the exact time period of human civilization, is this whole nice, sweet, flat spot right here with stable global temperature. And so there's ending your ice age. So here we are today for temperature, and we've warmed up 0.8 degrees. We're sort of already flirting with getting outside of this 10,000-year window civilization's been in. And basically, here's the options. Here's where temperature goes in the future. And this is sort of a low emission scenario. We only go up a couple degrees. Here's a high emission scenario where we burn basically all of it. We go up to 5,000 gigatons of carbon, burn a lot. Then you're going up maybe 8 degrees. And a couple of interesting things just to see here is one, the scale of changes we're talking about here, if we burn a lot, it's the same order of scale of changes as ending an ice age. So it's not small, it's huge. The other thing about it is this line is a lot steeper than that line. You're talking about something on the scale of ending an ice age in terms of temperature, but doing it many times faster, order of magnitude plus faster. And then the other thing you see is that once you set the temperatures high, you put that thermostat up, it's not coming down quickly because of all this inertia. It's not coming down. We're just resetting the state of the planet. And this graph stretches out 10,000 years into the future. Okay? So I think that's the big picture bottom line that I try to keep in mind. I'm a geologist, and I see this more and more, and I think most geologists really do. This is just geological in scale. You're really talking about just reshaping the whole planet, and in pretty short order. It's a pretty profound thing to do. Think about how you can change a planet. To pull the solid carbon out of the ground on a planet, burn it, put it as gas in the atmosphere, it's one of the most profound ways you can possibly just science fiction kind of reinvent the whole world. So you can see why I say climate science is sort of pressing. But that's all I got for you, and I'll turn it over and have a good conversation after this. Are you using this, or do you want me to hold them? Yeah.
I think we're changing up the order of things a little bit here, so I'm going now. Listening to climate scientists always really terrifies me, but that was a very good presentation. And yeah, sort of jumping off a similar point there, I think our generation right now is living in a really extraordinary moment. The International Energy Agency, which is, I think Jeremy made the point, he showed that graph of the energy, all the lights on the planet, and made that point about the inertia of our energy infrastructure system, and the International Energy Agency is sort of the group that thinks about that at the international level. And a couple of years ago, they published their annual World Energy Outlook report, and they said that we're going to be locked into 2 degrees Celsius warming by 2017. That's 3 years away right now. What they meant by locked in was that we'll have built so much new fossil fuel infrastructure that if all that stuff is used to the end of its infrastructural lifetime, we'll have consumed our carbon budget. So that, 2034 can sound kind of far away, but really the decisions we make in the next few years are the ones that determine, are we going to draw the line and stop building new fossil fuels at this moment, or are we going to start building clean energy, relying on energy efficiency and conservation to meet our new energy demand from this point forward, and replace all the stuff like coal that's already retiring naturally? That's what this moment, these few years are all about. And understanding that was really what led me to take time off from school, and it was very hard for me last year to try to decide my major at Harvard when I couldn't even predict what my future will be like, when there's this huge uncertainty. Are we going to go over to C? Are we not? Are we going to make the right choice as society, or are we going to lock ourselves into these horrible, the impacts of climate change, I think, can sometimes seem very abstract. We talk about sea level rise. What does that mean? That means a large part of Boston, most of Florida, all of New Orleans underwater. That means stronger storms hitting our coasts, and in many places making the coastal regions totally uninhabitable. But where can people go? If we head inland in the US, for example, we're going to see, what's the West right now? It's turning into a dust bowl. There's some science that says the Midwest, which is, America's breadbasket, it'll be a dust bowl by mid-century, or, the end of this century. That sounds like a long time away, but really, how old will you be in 2050? Most of us in this room will still be alive. This is about our lives here. And I think another sort of terrifying thing is that ultimately what climate change will do is it'll threaten our water supplies and the regions that we rely on for food right now. And if you take away water, if you take away food, if you make those resources very scarce in our society, you'll create a lot of geopolitical conflict. The Arab Spring rose out of extremely high food prices that were a result of a drought, an extreme drought in Russia the summer earlier. And what do we have now? Millions of refugees in Syria? I think that's one of the most frightening things about the climate crisis, the idea of these shortages being absolutely everywhere, all over the planet, and leading to that sort of conflict. It's inescapable. There's no safe space left for us in the world with the climate crisis. At the same time, though, I think we're sort of living in a moment of we still have this choice. We can still pick the other road, and that's beautiful. We have the chance, if we go about trying to build climate justice solutions, we can build ourselves a new world that's better than the one we have right now. We won't force communities that live next to coal plants or oil extraction wells to sort of suffocate from the toxic air and water pollution that they're dealing with right now. We'll be investing, relocalizing, recreating our communities and our, relocalizing the food system, expanding out public transit that gives everyone, no matter their, class background or their ability to afford a car, it gives everyone the access to transit and movement and all the opportunities that leads to. So while the climate crisis is terrifying, I think the flip side is, really optimistic and beautiful, and that's the future I want us to build. I don't want to inherit this horror story of climate change. And our generation has the power right now to make that choice, to pick the other route. And so, facing that choice, the question is now, okay, what do we do? We're too young to ever get the chance to, work up to some big career in government where we can make the changes directly ourselves. We have to do something to get the broader decision makers to do the right thing for us. So I think, I certainly, when I first learned about climate change, I dove into like recycling on campus and trying to get solar panels for the roof of my high school and all that sort of stuff, and that's great. But it's, those sort of individual lifestyle changes are never going to be enough to deal with the scale of the climate crisis. To, say this in a very extreme way, we could like take the whole national divestment movement right now, or everyone who cares about climate change, and I don't know, like some very large number of people, and we could just, if we like just disappeared off the face of the planet, or if you're thinking about like campus changes at BC, if BC disappeared off the face of the planet, it wouldn't emit anything anymore. But as a planet, we'd still be hurtling off the climate cliff. We have to come up with a way to create broader political change here. I think the next immediate response is going to say, well, okay, let's jump into politics. Let's try to elect some really awesome candidates who will, do whatever they can about climate change, or like, let's push the people in office to start doing more. And the problem is that the fossil fuel industry has, they're the wealthiest industry in the history of money, and they've made it pretty impossible to get anything done politically. People have known about climate change for longer than we've been alive, and things are still getting worse. I don't mean to downplay like the complex, economic and sort of social factors dealing with climate change, but really, you got like people have had more than 20 years to figure it out by now, and the reason they haven't is because the fossil fuel industry has, gotten in the way at every step, because taking action on climate change means that fossil fuel companies have to cease to exist. All those gigatons of carbon, those companies own them, they represent potential profit. If we're going to solve climate change, that stuff has to stay in the ground. They can't sell it. They can't get that profit if we want our generation to survive. And so, as you might expect, these people have fought it very hard. The whole climate denial movement is something that was largely created by fossil fuel companies. There are memos showing the American Petroleum Institute bringing all these, like Exxon, Chevron, these other fossil fuel companies together in the 1990s to pull off this huge media strategy where they, brought sort of like fake climate scientists on speaking tours and made sure that journalists were always quoting scientists who didn't believe in climate change. And literally they said, there's still a window of opportunity to question climate science. And so where do we end up today in 2014? Half of the Republicans in Congress say that they don't think climate change is caused by humans, or they say they don't think it's real. That's a result of the fossil fuel industry sort of using propaganda and manipulating society to protect their interests. That's part of the reason it's so hard to get political change. The other part is that, again, they're the wealthiest industry around here. Their wealth gives them a lot of power to throw their weight around in our political system, whether that's lobbying, whether that's campaign finance. You can look at, some of you, if you're seniors in this room, might remember Senator Scott Brown, who actually just left office, and we replaced him with Elizabeth Warren last November. But when he was elected, before that, he was a state legislator, and he was pretty good on climate change. He voted for the Global Warming Solutions Act here, which is sort of our state climate legislation. It's some of the best in the nation. He said that global warming was one of the most important issues. And then when he ran for Senate, he took $400,000 from the fossil fuel industry, and suddenly, oh, I don't know if climate change exists. That's what came out of his mouth. A few years later, it was saying some sort of weird, complicated argument about how the Senate shouldn't act on climate because it's a local issue for like cities and states to take care of. Clearly, the science hadn't changed. The science had only gotten more solid in that time. But that's what the wealth of the fossil fuel industry can do, given the way campaign finance and our electoral system is set up right now. And if we were trying to jump into politics right now, I think we'd be playing on a drastically uneven battlefield. I mean, it would be like, I don't know, playing chess where our side our generation side is just a bunch of pawns, and their side is all queens or rooks or like the most powerful pieces you can imagine. Like, we don't have a chance right now. But, so this is where we get to divestment, because divestment shifts it. We're not on this, national political electoral battlefield that we don't have a hope in anymore. We're shifting that battlefield to our campuses, our churches, our local towns, where we do have a chance, because our voices are louder in these places, and ourselves as constituents can be more powerful than the fossil fuel industry's money in these places. So what is divestment? Colleges and universities, as well as churches and cities are a bit different, but colleges and universities all have endowments, which is sort of the bucket of money that's collected from alumni donations that's used to, to some extent do some operating costs or, other things to keep the school running. And our universities invest that money. Probably at a place like BC, they'll invest it through a management firm. I'm sure David will talk more about that later. But basically, BC probably owns a good amount of stock in fossil fuel companies, the same companies that are responsible for stopping political action against climate change and thereby threatening our future. And that gives us some leverage here. Divestment is a tactic where you take your money, your investments out of an industry that you think is morally reprehensible and shift them into something else. And the big goal here is not to try to undercut the economic power of fossil fuel companies. The stock market doesn't work like that. It's rather to send a very strong message about those sort of morally reprehensible actions that the fossil fuel companies are taking, and thereby take away the social license of fossil fuel companies. And it's sort of a complicated thing, but I like to think about divestment as doing two things simultaneously. It's not going to solve the climate crisis, but it'll put us in a place where we can, because divestment both builds our power as a climate justice movement while also decreasing the power of the fossil fuel industry. It's starting to level that battlefield we have to play on here. And the main way it does this is by taking away the social license of the fossil fuel companies. You can look at past divestment movements. There's one around tobacco divestment. I think it started in the early 1990s, and it led to politicians. It created such a toxic image for tobacco corporations that 10 years later, politicians were refusing to take any money from tobacco corporations. That still happens today. Politicians will get checks in the mail and they'll send them right back because they don't want their candidate's image to be stained by these sort of companies that have been branded as social pariahs. And along the way, as all sort of the noise of the divestment movements get really loud, that creates ripple effects in our political system. During the divestment movement from apartheid South Africa, back in the 70s and 80s, there was this sort of amazing historical moment where the Republican-controlled House and Senate passed what was known as the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act. President Reagan vetoed that, but then the Senate overturned it. They had because there was so much grassroots support coming out of the divestment movements and other sort of grassroots things going on against apartheid South Africa, they overrode Reagan's veto. And those were Republicans in control of the Senate. That's the power of divestment. If we could get to that sort of place on climate change, we'd have a fighting chance. And so yeah, that's kind of the big, that's like the first level of explaining how divestment works as a tactic. I think there are some other ways that are also really important that divestment kind of plays out here. One is shifting other investors. Once we began the divestment movement on campus, we got some big name investors like Tom Steyer, who's a hedge fund billionaire over in California, and Beavis Longstreth, who's the former SEC commissioner under Ronald Reagan. The two of them started speaking up in support of divestment. And there's a whole new investors network on climate risk that Tom Steyer started. And as these, big Wall Street types who know things about finance start getting involved and looking at the risks of being invested in fossil fuels, they start moving their money, and This makes it easier for us to get climate action politically, because right now, there's a lot of money invested in fossil fuel companies, and that means there's a lot of people who stand to lose money if we decide to cap carbon emissions in this country. Divestment is starting to move the money out of the fossil fuel industry and thereby making it a little easier to get political action down the road. The other thing divestment does here is it kind of breaks this narrative that the fossil fuel industry has told us. Because they have a lot of money, they have a very loud megaphone in the society, and they've told us that, you know, they're this sort of benign, cooperative entity. They're doing something good for society, right? They're providing cheap energy to all these people who wouldn't be able to afford it otherwise. Divestment is a clear statement that we cannot work with fossil fuel companies. They have to go. It's them or it's us. And that's kind of a new story we're telling here. But again, that'll help us decrease their influence over our political system. And I think that's, you know, that's the argument we've heard most loudly from our president back at Harvard. You know, she's been saying, you should use shareholder advocacy, you should try to engage with these companies. And that's, we don't have time for that anymore. You know, it's them or it's us. I think, and part of what the divestment movement does as a social movement is it amplifies the voices of folks who have the most experience with the fossil fuel companies. And those are the folks who live in communities with coal plants, or up in Canada near tar sands oil extraction mines, whose, you know, entire ways of life have been destroyed by the industry. And they've gone to shareholder meetings, they've tried to get these companies to change their business plans. And even when you throw all this evidence about the cancers and water pollution and just pure destruction and death that these companies are causing, they won't change their minds. I was at a Bank of America's shareholder meeting last May, talking to Bank of America about coal divestment, because they're the bank that has the greatest investments in coal. And it was very shocking, but to me, to see people, you know, stand up and say to the CEO, like, I live in a community right next to a coal plant your bank owns, and my sister died of cancer last year that was caused by the coal plant that you own, and what are you going to do about this? And the CEO's response, next question, next question, next question, every single time. There must have been 30 stories like that. It was madness, and that's what our generation has to fight against here, you know. And I think the other sort of narrative that I think is important to break with the fossil fuel companies is this idea that it's hopeless, that we'll never be able to live without them, that we'll never break our addiction, that there aren't alternatives, and there's nothing we can do. That's wrong, you know. We're starting to see there are alternatives out there ready to be built if the fossil fuel industry would get out of the way, largely. That's something that the divestment movement can help amplify and, you know, create this sort of, our divestment campaigns can help us grab the megaphone back that the fossil fuel companies have used. And we can start telling a new story about the generation, or about the future we want to see. And we can say that we want that future with clean energy, not fossil fuels. And I think, you know, down the line, our generation is a really important constituency for politicians. They know that we vote right now. We're also the people most likely to be out knocking on doors for candidates. And politicians will sort of flock to where they see organized people, because they think that's like where they can find votes and energy. And so by organizing around divestment, we'll see politicians coming to us. I've seen it in Cambridge with the city councillor, Leland Chung, who came to the Divest Harvard campaign. He's now running for lieutenant governor. And we've got a really strong connection with him now, and that's really great. But it's because of Divest Harvard. We weren't targeting him directly, it was just a ripple effect. So that's another way that divestment can, you know, sort of open the door for future political action. Yeah. Time? Thank you. Cool. So that was pretty much where I was at. I think the sort of last point here is that if you think about where we're at in universities, we're sort of concentrations of power in a way. Our presidents and our board of trustees aren't just like random alumni or random people off the street. They tend to be very influential figures in many sort of economic spheres across the country. Divestment forces them to pick a side. Are they going to stand with the fossil fuel industry, or are they going to stand with us? And by putting the climate crisis on their agenda, again, we'll be creating ripple effects throughout society. So that, I guess, is the last point to leave you with. I think divestment on its surface seems like a pretty simple thing, just moving money, stigmatizing the industry, but the process of divestment will create much broader grassroots change that can, I think it's like a real chance we have. Even as we have very little time left, we still have the chance to fight, and this is the way we need to do it.
Thank you. I'll touch on a couple of things that you said, both of you, and I think it really leads into what it is that I do and how it relates to the movements on campus having to do with divestment. First of all, your talk about climate change and global warming, I would assume that most people in the room here are on this side of believing that global warming is happening, and it's an interest of yours, and I'm not sure how many are here trying to decide one way or the other whether this is happening. So those are pretty straightforward facts of what's going on, what could happen, and the changes that we're going to be seeing over the years if we don't make some changes to the way that we use and burn fossil fuels. And then from Alli, right, on the whole divestment movement, I'm sure you're all very familiar with what's going on in the world of divestment on college campuses, in municipalities and communities of faith and other things that Alli mentioned. But there's a lot of resistance from the people that are doing the actual investing of the money. So just to give you a little bit of background where I come from, as I work in the socially responsible investment world, we mostly work with individuals with all varying levels of account sizes, but we invest the money in socially responsible ways, which is looking at it from a number of different perspectives. But we've also, over the past few years, had a large uptick in the interest from our clients to invest their own money in fossil fuel-free ways as well. So it is doable, and it's growing drastically throughout the industry. You're seeing all sorts of investment companies and individuals start to look at ways of providing opportunities to invest their money along the lines of people's values. So as I'm talking a little bit about the overview of divestment and what it is, I know Alli kind of shared it with you, and I don't know how many of you are involved with the divestment movement here on the BC campus, and what kind of things you've done. But think to yourself as we're talking about all this is, what are the reactions, or what are the things that the investment committees or the board or whoever you may be talking to might be coming back with when they say, well, we can't do it, or we shouldn't do it, and this is why. I think it was Bill McKibben, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. He said something along the lines of, if it's not right for these, or if we believe it's not right for these companies to ruin the planet, is it right for us as individuals or as institutions to be profiting off the ruining of the planet or the wreckage that's occurring? So it's certainly something to think about, and I'm glad that Alli's talk really focused a lot on creating that voice and creating that action. When the first divestment movement kind of got started, there were a lot of people on the side of the coin saying, well, if we can get our institution to divest, it's really going to hurt the fossil fuel industries from a financial perspective. And that's probably not the case, whether you sell all their stock or not. If it's in a large amount, an extremely large amount, you may see that. But I think you're absolutely right, where the whole goal of divestment and the whole role of it is to take that stand from a moral standpoint and say, we don't believe that we should be profiting from these companies that are doing X, Y, Z, whatever it may be, whether it was tobacco, whether it was things having to do with apartheid in South Africa, or whether it has to do with the fossil fuels and the global climate change that we have. My experience from talking with students from different universities is that what you hear back from the university is, well, we can't divest for a couple of reasons. One is there's a lot of universities who may say, we don't want to take a political stand with our investments. That's their prerogative to say so, and I think where you go with that is down the lines of the moral argument of, what are the universities usually in the business of doing? What do they say in their mottos or on their seals or in that book that you get when you walk in freshman orientation? And it talks all about, you know, we're here to create a better society, we're here to create a future of change, we're here to create students who will someday be an integral part of how society functions, how it improves, and creating a society that will last for a very long time and many generations to come. And when you look at the whole issue of divestment and what the fossil fuel companies are doing, as you spoke about earlier, you look at it from the perspective of, we're focusing on creating a better world within our classrooms. Are we focusing on creating a better world and a more sustainable world overall from the number of different things that we do? So, you know, when we talk about divestment, it's what is it actually that we're looking for? And, you know, 350.org and the Do the Math Tour, which I think you're familiar with, you know, they're calling for something that's not very complicated to start, right? They're talking about only 200 companies. We want you to divest immediately, you know, no more direct investment in these companies, and over time to divest them out of the portfolio so that you no longer hold stock in those companies. And, you know, you talk a little bit about shareholder meetings at the Bank of America. When you own stock, you own a piece of that company. When your stock goes up and you make profits, you're making profits based on the profits of those companies and what those companies are doing. So to ask the university to remove themselves from those investments is just a way of really saying we don't want to, or we shouldn't be making money from these companies that are creating a society that's not sustainable for really the graduates who are leaving these schools and going to be working for the next 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years, however long it will be. So, you know, it's really, truly a moral argument in my view, but the responses that you'll often find come from the financial side, where, well, we can't divest, or we're going to lose money by divesting, or our endowments are there to support the students, and if we don't invest it in the most responsible economic way or financial way, are we going to be hurting the students or hurting the funding that we have for student programs, for scholarships, and all those other things that they use that money for? There's studies that you can find all over the place that look at, and there's been a lot more of them recently, about what happens to a portfolio if you remove fossil fuels from it. And the studies, you know, you can always find studies no matter what you're looking at that go both ways, right? Some say, oh, you can do better if you remove fossil fuels from your portfolio. Some say you can do worse if you remove fossil fuels from your portfolio. But the fact of the matter is there's more to investing in building an endowment, let's say, for the school, than just simply removing things from it. So what are you going to do with that money also? How's that money going to be invested maybe in a different way? And again, you'll see the studies that go both ways. But the fact is that most of them come up with a very little difference, whether it's improved performance or whether it's not quite as good performance. The difference is extremely small. The studies that have been out there lately have shown actually that fossil fuel-free portfolios, or especially the portfolios divested from those 200 companies, have performed just as well, if not better, over the past 7 or 8 years. If you go 12 years, things might change, or 14 years, things might change. So you got to take it all with a grain of salt, but understand that there's professionals managing the endowments and there's professionals managing that money. So what they're getting paid for, what their job is to build a portfolio in the most appropriate way from a financial aspect. And if they can't do that with pulling a few choices out of the basket of choices that they have, it's doubtful. It's just something that's new, something that's different, and it might change the way that people are looking at it. And that creates a sense of hesitancy, no matter what you're doing, right? I've always done things one way, that's the way I know how to do them. To make a change, I don't know what's going to happen with that change and if I can do it. So I look at it from the perspective of that. So you know, that's looking at it really from an investment standpoint and how it all comes together. I would guess that most of you are in line with kind of the reasons to divest, and I see a lot of them up here on the poster of the divestment campaign here on campus. But you know, obviously one is aligning. This is, you know, we work with individuals, so it's much easier to talk to one person who comes to us with the values that they want their investments to align with their values. It's much more difficult when you look at a college campus, right? Because there's, I don't know, 10, 20, 30,000 students here sometimes. and then the alumni network and all the people that are working here as well. And it's, you know, trying to get a understanding and a unified voice from all of them. So I do understand the challenges that you face here as a student body, and I certainly understand the challenges from the investment committee, you know, here at BC and other colleges and what they're looking at. It's not like working with an individual who we get, who come in and say, I don't want to invest in fossil fuels, and there's nobody else to talk to about it. You know, we can just go forward with that. But you know, the number one reason that we talk about is aligning those investments with your values. You know, should you be investing in things that you don't believe in? Should you be profiting from things that you don't believe in? Should you be profiting in companies that you wouldn't be proud to tell somebody that you work for, or that you own, or that you, you know, support in financial ways? The other thing which you talked about a little bit more in detail is helping to shape public policy, right? I think the biggest thing we've seen here from the 350 organization and the Do the Math tour was really that it has lit a fire under everybody. It's brought generations together, it's brought people from different sides of the aisle together, it's brought different countries together, in an understanding that there is a problem, and it's really created that voice. And I think the more movement that you see on college campuses, and the more commitment that you see from colleges themselves, are only going to increase that voice. And hopefully it'll get to that point where it starts creating issues, or at least a different thought process from these fossil fuel companies and from the politicians alike. It's not only the student body, right, but it's the alumni as well. And these things, you know, it's a family. I know the schools in Boston especially, you have a very good, you know, large alumni network and relationships that carry on. These schools have been around for a very, very long time. And it's about creating that reputation for the school and for the school network is, are we somebody who's leading in social change? Are we somebody who's paying attention to social justice? And are we doing what is right, not just by us, but are we doing what is right for the world? So that's, you know, on the side of public policy. The big kind of thing that's going on now, and you'll see a lot of this being written about, and you know, certainly a lot of people talking about it, is looking at the investments in the fossil fuel industry, or divestment. By divesting from them, actually lowering your financial risk. And this again is something that's yet to be proven one way or another, but we talk a lot about the carbon bubble. And you mentioned it, I think you mentioned the carbon bubble as well, when we talk about all of the reserves that are under the ground. The largest of fossil fuel companies, which we're really focusing on, those largest 200 with the reserves underground, that's part of the value of the company. And, you know, to put it in more concrete kind of a way to think about it, is if there was a company down the road who had, you know, $7 million worth of typewriters in their warehouse, yeah, they may be worth $7 million, but they're not truly, because you can't do anything with them. And if that's the point where we no longer use them, or we can't get them out and sell them to anybody, the value of those companies decrease drastically. So there's a lot of risk. It's kind of potential risk right now, because we don't really know what's going to happen, but there is risk associated with this carbon bubble, with the fact that the reserves are so large, and what's going to happen to them. If they have to stay in the ground, the value of these companies is going to change drastically. I mean, you are seeing a lot of these companies start to think about becoming more energy companies rather than just extraction companies, because they're starting to see the light and the writing on the wall, but they're still spending millions and millions of dollars on a daily basis to find even more reserves. Even though we're all saying that they have enough already, they have more than could ever burn safely, but they still spend money exploring for more. So that's when you hear the carbon bubble, and I'm sure you'll all hear about it, that's what they're talking about from the investment standpoint, is that are those assets that they have underground truly going to be assets in the future? You have the risk of climate change, and things will change. You have political risk, whether there's you know, movement against those. One of you mentioned carbon tax. How will that affect the industry, the fossil fuel industry? And then, you know, and then if there's legislation, and hopefully there will be legislation that limits the amount of carbon that we burn, that affects these companies as well. So again, it's nothing written in stone. It's just some potential risks that may be out there, but those risks may become very true and concrete eventually down the line. You know, I don't want to take up too much time, because I think the questions and answers are probably get more to the point and the things that are on your mind, let me say it. We'll probably talk a little bit more about this as we go forward, but I mentioned a little bit earlier is what can an investor as an individual do, or what can an endowment do in managing it. There's a lot of different thoughts on that, right? It can remove their money from investments in these companies, and then what do you do with it? When you read a lot of the research, it kind of makes it sound like they're taking the money out of these fossil fuel companies and just sticking it under their mattress, because they always talk about, well, we would have missed out on this return, or we would have missed out on this profit. It obviously depends on what you do with that money, whether you invest it in other things that you currently have, whether you invest it in things that are making a difference, like the clean energy industry or something like that. So it's more of a process than just removing these things from the portfolio. It's how do we reallocate the endowment or that portfolio in ways that still will create what we need that money to do. And that's, I think, the biggest challenge is getting that connection between the people that are pushing the movement and the people that are controlling the financial decisions. One other thing I just want to look at from that perspective is, and do the math, call to action. That first step is no direct investment in these companies, right? So you're all probably aware, right? You can go out and buy stock in a certain company, right? That's a direct investment in those companies. It's not that hard to say, well, I'm not going to buy stock in that one company and just not do it, right? The issues come in when we talk more about kind of indirect investments, where it's a pooling of money together and these companies are buying a portfolio of investments as they are. And that's where a lot of the hesitancy in whether we can do this or not, when people say that, is, well, I can certainly go down and say, I don't want to buy this stock. But if I buy a portfolio of investments, how can I control what's in it? And you maybe can't control what's in it, but you can certainly screen through it and find out what you're investing in and avoid the things that are there. And I think what you're seeing now, and you're going to continue to see, is a number of options for people to invest their money in ways that align much more with their values, or more specifically with the whole fossil fuel divestment. As the push is growing at college campuses, communities of faith, in different municipalities, and in the individual level as well, these companies are starting to offer many more opportunities for people to look at the investments from this standpoint. The last thing I'll say, and then we can all have a seat and answer any questions that you may have, has to do with, if you're paying attention to kind of the financial news and different people who are speaking, you mentioned a couple that Harvard has a connection with. There's even people outside of the socially responsible investment world, people outside the world of even caring about the environment, who are talking about the investments in fossil fuel companies as not a great investment at this time. Not overall, but there are certainly the ones that you look at where they're saying there's a lot of this potential risk that I was talking about, and it's not the same kind of investment it would have been 20, 30 years ago when nobody was talking about climate change, nobody was trying to stand in the way of the fossil fuel companies, and things were just continuing on as they were. So I'll leave it there, and then we can certainly answer some questions that you may have going forward.
So if our panelists could come up here, I really want to use that table because I loved it from the class. And we can open it up. So somebody have a question, a comment, a thought? Maybe while people think, I'll kick it off. I have a good one. Alli brought up the apartheid campaign, and I'm curious more about what we can learn from the divestment campaign to attack this racist, brutal regime in South Africa. It started in the 60s. It started to get some real traction, I guess, in the 70s, and then late 70s, especially early 80s. It wasn't until 1990 that apartheid really ended. It wasn't until 94 that Mandela was elected. That in the context of, we have no time left. That in the context of no more fossil fuel infrastructure by 2017. What kind of, what can we learn and make things happen faster?
Well, yeah, luckily we're standing on the shoulders of giants here with a lot of apartheid divestment activists. You know, were able to use the knowledge they gained because they were really pioneering the tactic at that time, so they were, you know, figuring out all of the technical loopholes and all the nonsense that has kind of been figured out right now that's sort of compiled into really easily accessible resources that we can draw on right now. So a lot of the groundwork has just been done for us right now. And that was sort of, you know, built upon with tobacco divestment or divestment from companies supporting Darfur, genocide in Darfur in the early 2000s, as well as the Palestinian boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement right now. So there's been a lot that's been done, I think, is kind of my first feeling about that. I think another thing that plays to our advantage on the time is the technology we're dealing with right now. We have emails and computers, and that's really fast and awesome for us. We also have social media, which, you know, sort of lets us bypass the corporate media gatekeepers who could, and often do with climate change, prevent, you know, fair coverage of what we're doing from being brought to light. We can get around that with social media to some extent. So that's another thing that's kind of in our favor right now. And I think that will really speed things up. I was talking last week with one of the, he was a student who did apartheid divestment at Columbia and actually got expelled from Columbia College for his work, and then went on to coordinate apartheid divestment work nationally. And he was telling me about how it would take them 4 days to get out a mailing because they had to use a mimeograph machine, or I don't know if I said that right. I don't know what it is actually. But you know, when we can print that in, you know, 2 minutes right now. So I think that is where I have a lot of hope for us speeding up here. I don't know if I heard you.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just touch briefly on the divestment from apartheid. I know it was before your time, most of your times, and kind of before my time. But you know, this is a much bigger fight. The divestment from South Africa, divesting from companies that were doing business there, it was pushing companies to change the way that they were doing business or a piece of their business. What we're talking about here is a much bigger fight where we're looking at companies changing the way that, basically changing their business, right? It's not just that piece of it or what you're doing wrong, right? We can fight to, and we talked a little bit about shareholder activism, and that's one of the reasons why people say, oh, we should hold investments in fossil fuel companies so we have a voice at those shareholder meetings. I'm guessing, I don't know, maybe not. Most of you have seen the movie Mr. Deeds. Have you seen that movie? You know, at the end where they're all in that big room and they're all, that's basically, those are all the shareholders and they have a voice and they can vote on different things that are going on. But you can't vote really, you can't bring shareholder resolutions that basically put an end to the operations of that business. So that's where that challenge is on the shareholder activism side, where that part of it actually may have been more, may have played a stronger role, or could have, in something like the divestment movement from South Africa, where here it's a much larger picture of what we have.
Okay. I was just gonna ask, I know we like kind of talk really vaguely and everybody kind of knows about the alternative sources of energy out there. But I know like my parents, even when I told them about the divestment movement, they're like, there's no other way. And like I know people take issue divesting when they say we still use fossil fuels. So do you guys maybe have anything to say about the possibility of alternative energies and if that's actually a plausible thing?
But it's really not my territory. I mean, I could talk about it from a financial perspective of investing in these companies, right? But I really can't get into specifics when it comes to investments and just sharing that information with the crowd. But if you want specific, more specific information about it, I'm certainly happy to talk to you later on. From the industry standpoint of what's going on in alternative energy or what's going on with fossil fuels, I mean, that's not where I focus my time. what I see is great development and great products and great things coming down the pipeline and great technologies. And I think we will, eventually move in a better direction. I don't know if we're going to move totally in the right direction, but I think the better direction is that. When you mention something about, using these things, it's like, well, you can divest your portfolio from fossil fuels, you can go out and stand with your sign fighting the fossil fuel companies, but the fact of the matter is for most of us at varying levels, we are using fossil fuels every day, whether it's in our cars, whether it's even in public transportation, whether it's in the paper or the pens or the bottles, whatever it may be. Yes, right now we're all connected to the fossil fuel industry, and you can't build a clean energy industry without the fossil fuel industry right now because there's not enough clean energy infrastructure. So it's something important to understand and important to realize, and I kind of look at those arguments as a bit catty when you hear people making statements like, oh, well, you're fighting for a greener planet, but you flew a plane to get to this meeting or whatever it may be. Unfortunately, that's kind of the world we live in. What you can do is just make any improvements that you can. Right? Is taking the bus better than driving a car? Yes. Is it fossil fuel free? No. But those are those steps that people can make on an individual level.
I think there have also been, a few studies that have come out in the past few years looking at the feasibility of meeting, our entire energy demand in some cases through renewables. And there's a pair of engineers out in California who did a very big study and they found that, it would technologically be feasible to do it by mid-century to have everything be renewable. I know a little bit more about the energy situation in Massachusetts, where right now we're working on a campaign with Better Future Project in 350 Massachusetts to sort of draw a hard line and say, okay, we've got the fossil fuels we've got right now, but from this point forward, let's only build renewables. And that should be feasible. Like, the cost of wind in some places is like lower than even the cost of natural gas. Coal plants have become really expensive. They're getting shut down. And, even, I think the media is telling sometimes a very incorrect story about the feasibility of renewables. Just last week, the Boston Globe had some ridiculous headline about how Governor Patrick's plan for distributed solar production, which would it's the sort of solar that's not owned by one company, but it's like a solar panel on every roof, which saves people a lot of money every month when they don't have to pay for that electricity in their utility bills. So his plan that he just proposed would cost $1 billion over 20 years, and all the media reports that I saw about it were like, look at how expensive this is, blah, 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 blah. And then you'd read through the article, and it would say, this adds $1.50 extra to the average consumer's utility bill. And I mean, I'm like a part-time waitress, I don't have that much money. I know how much my utility bill costs, and even I wouldn't notice $1.50 extra per month. So I think, it is complicated. I'm not an energy economics expert, but I think the commonly held assumption that renewables are just, overpriced and impossible is just wrong. You see, I think Bloomberg News does a really good job of covering energy economics, and I think, you can look there for more information on where the costs of wind and solar are going, but they're definitely going down while fossil fuel costs are going up. So it's kind of a matter of, the shift is coming, but how fast will that shift come? Can our government do things like, provide subsidies to these companies and not continue providing subsidies to fossil fuel companies to sort of speed up that transition?
I think Mark Jacobson
Yeah,
is the
that's
name
the
of the
one.
guy at Stanford who did the study that Alli's talking about. And I just heard that along with some activist type actor, yeah, they're going to release a report about how every single individual state can go 100% renewable. I think something within 20 years maybe. But keep your eye out for that, because it would be nice. It's nice to live in Massachusetts and know that information about Massachusetts. It'd be useful for your parents wherever they live to say, hey, actually, here's a plan for your state to be 100% renewable. We can do it with current technology. This is how much it'll cost us. This is how much it'll save us.
It's basically a question of political will. our government has provided tons of money to support fossil fuel industry research. Over the few years, we have a lot of subsidies and tax breaks sort of ingrained in our system right now that continue supporting the fossil fuel industry. If there were the political will to shift that money and support, we would be able to do plans like that. It's just a matter of like building the momentum to make it happen.
This is a financial question. You say you're not an expert on the actual setting up of the alternative fuels. We have had a couple of instances of companies making the solar panels that have gone broke in this country. Well, first of all, have they been sabotaged? I know there was a competition with much cheaper Chinese solar panels that had a great deal to do with doing them in. But were they done in by the fossil fuel industry? And the other part of the question, it seems to me that until recently, there was government subsidy putting up solar panels. It seems to have disappeared.
The first question I really couldn't offer, I can offer an opinion on, but I think it's, it's an industry like any other industry, right? Where, there was a lot of that talk about, was there undercutting going on with solar panels coming in from other countries? I have absolutely no idea when it comes to the conspiracy side of things of what happens, and was there actually action to shut these companies down? I would say I would believe it personally, and I would hate to think that it would actually happen, but you certainly can't put it beyond anybody. These companies have a lot of power and a lot of will, a lot of political will, and a lot of financial power as well. So I wouldn't necessarily say that. I think it was just kind of competition the way all competition is. You come up with a product. If there are the same products coming at a cheaper rate, or if there are better products coming at a cheaper, same or better rate, it's really just kind of how economics work. And what we saw was a large influx of the opportunities to get cheaper things from other countries and other companies. And as a business owner, you have to make a decision on what you're going to do and how you're going to stay ahead of the curve. And I'm not sure if they did that in the most appropriate ways. And the second part of your question was?
Government supplement for putting up solar panels. Has that vanished?
I think, from what I understand, all states have different different policies in place. There are states that provide more subsidies, tax breaks, tax credits, whatever it may be, for individuals to do so on their homes. There's different ways of setting it up, whether it's shared, whether it's individual, whether you can net meter or not. So there's a lot of different programs out there, and I think, again, it's just like anything else you'll see, is those are going to change over time. There'll be things in place, there'll be things that are gone, and those certainly will adjust from year to year.
So I have a question for the climate scientist here. So for us, it's trying to campaign for divestment here. It's hard to, in a quick, phrase or two, convince people why climate change is so devastating and it's such a detrimental problem for our generation. For you, what is the most gripping future reality that is factual and not just blown out of the water? And
the most gripping impact, the most gripping.
Yeah, that we could share with
people
people.
Can just understand what
Yeah.
it means. There's a lot. There's a lot of things you can point to now. How much they're all related to climate change or not isn't always easy to ascertain, but I'm concerned. But there's this California drought going on these last few months. Is that related to climate change? That's hard to say if we're given drought or not. Plausibly, might see more of that. That's sort of the prediction for the southwest of the U.S. That's something I think people understand, right? I've heard enough news reports, articles, people talking about agricultural yields in California and how much it's going to cost them. So rainfall's a good one, I think. And there are certain parts of the world where we have pretty good confidence that rain is going to go up or down. And like the southwestern U.S. is one that pretty consistently in models is like, this place is going to dry out more than it already is. And it's one of the fastest growing parts of the country. So I think rain's an important one. Sea level is another one that you always come back to because everyone can get sea level, and sea level is global. And sea level, again, we put the temperatures up and the seas will just keep climbing, and that's a really hard thing to stop once you've set it in motion. And what does that mean? In the longer term, what it means is lots of coastal areas going underwater, so that's something anybody can understand. You can flood, it's going to be centuries down the road, maybe to get to the point of 20 feet higher, but the next few decades we'll set that. If we get the temperatures high enough, in the next few decades, lower Manhattan is destined for drowning, as are any area that's under 20 feet. That's a goner. That's a problem. In the near term, something to point to is that as you just raise sea levels a foot or two or three, something like a Hurricane Sandy. Sandy came in at just the right time, where it just lined up exactly with the tide, and it just hit right at high tide, and the water was channeled in just such a way that it just all blew into lower Manhattan and flooded the city. But you raise sea levels 3 feet by the end of the century, which I think most climate scientists would say, yeah, that's pretty reasonable, 3 feet for sure. And Sandy's are, it's not like 1 in 500 years, that's something like 1 in whatever, a handful of years. When you start hitting New York with Sandy's that frequently, that's something people can understand. That was, I think, 60 billion or something like that. So sea level is another one that I would mention to people. That's good.
Just real quick, on the sea level side, something that I think is very concrete is you look at the redrawing of flood areas and the insurance companies. And as you know, insurance companies, all they do is crunch numbers according to risk, right? And they're kind of calculating what the risk is that you're going to get sick or what the risk is that you're going to get in a car accident. There's a drastic redrawing right now of what which houses and where they are, that insurance companies are asking to cut to carry flood insurance. And you have to be in a flood plain to do that. So when these companies are looking at all the data and they're figuring out what is it going to cost us, what's the likelihood that this house is going to get flooded, that area has turned from a small area in some parts of coastal U.S. to very large areas. So like I said, all they do is crunch numbers on risk. And if they're saying, well, there's a better risk of this happening maybe every 10 years than rather every 100 years, that's some pretty concrete number crunching that has to be exactly what